Bonjour à tous, merci pour cette invitation, Vincent. Je suis très contente d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui. Donc cette séance s'intitule en effet Artification du document. Nous entendrons 3 différentes conférences, interventions. Je vais tout d'abord présenter le premier intervenant. Il s'agit de Liam Devlin, que je vais inviter à me rejoindre. Liam Devlin is a writer and photographer. He has an MA in documentary photography from the University of Wales, Newport, and is currently working on a PhD. Liam's research interrogates the debates that surround documentary practice within an art context. He's interested in how antagonistic, socially engaged art practices are a vital force in democratic society. Liam lectures within the School of Art, Media and Design at the University of Wales, and he has exhibited his work in Argentina, London and Dublin. Et Liam va nous parler aujourd'hui du Kurdistan. Le titre de son intervention, Creating Kurdistan, the Role of Photography as Discursive Documents. Et je lui laisse tout de suite la parole.
Thank you very much. People hear me okay? Just to preface, again, I make my apologies for my embarrassing lack of French. And also just to forward that this research, I was introduced as a photographer, and I actually haven't made any work in about 2 years, more of a kind of a sense of frustration. And the PhD is really a search for answers, really. So I've kind of moved away from making images to thinking about them and writing about them. Now, this title, Creating Kurdistan, and the paper seeks to use Susan Meiselas' engagement in the problematic construction of Kurdistan to discuss the relational qualities of photography when activated and considered as discursive documents. While the Kurdistan project is disseminated through 3 different formats of book publication, website and exhibition, I will focus on the particular construction of the book Kurdistan in the Shadow of History, and of the website, and particularly the website, aka Kurdistan. Now, to explore the relationship between art or representation and politics that is at the heart of this presentation, I will use the writings of the philosopher Jacques Rancière, primarily his theory of the distribution of the sensible from his book Aesthetics and Politics, and in particular his writings on the Emancipated Spectator from 2009. Now, hopefully this will help us to more usefully consider the production, dissemination and reception of Meiselas' Herculean project. Now, I said I was going to focus on the book and the website, which I am, but just as a compensation, I've got a picture of her exhibition, which suggests the kind of eclectic nature of the material that she uses. Now, photographic technologies of capture, manipulation and dissemination have become increasingly ubiquitous, operating within and across a plethora of different discourses, from eyewitnessing events to community and individual construction of identity. Cameras have become increasingly and immediately available, to the point where many people have a camera now, even if they don't have a camera, as our narcissistic tendencies have conflated digital cameras and mobile phones. Photographic images circulate around the globe at an unquantifiable pace and quantity, and regardless, I think, of the insightful and timely critiques of representation that have dominated photographic discourse since the 1970s. The majority of these images circulate as visual documents. Now, while these critiques have upset the myth of photographic objectivity, photography still has an evidential currency in the social order. Now, for Rancière, the social order, or as he terms it, the police order, is a set of implicit rules and conventions which determine the distribution of rules in a given community, and importantly, its forms of exclusion, which operate within it. This order is founded in what Rancière calls the distribution of the sensible. Here he is referring to the way in which rules and modes of participation in a common social world are determined by establishing possible modes of perception. Thus, the distribution of the sensible sets the divisions between what is visible and invisible, sayable and unsayable, audible and inaudible. And according to Rancière, therefore, by default, aesthetics is central to politics. Now, the notion of a visual and aesthetic aspect to political debate is, of course, a founding rationale for the role of documentary or concerned photographic practice, relying initially on the image's supposed veracity. This picture here of Meiselas in Nicaragua in 1979, the kind of epitome of the documentary photographer at the time, almost a stereotype now. Now, Susan Meiselas, her own career can be read as a series of exemplary examples, I believe, of the transformations that documentary photography has witnessed over the past 30 years, as we can trace how Meiselas' projects have evolved and transformed from the role of bearing witness photographically from within conflicts such as Nicaragua in the late 70s to the collection and construction of a living, growing archive of imagery and personal testimony for the non-existent state of Kurdistan. Now, just as an aside, apologies, the image isn't that great to begin with, but the light's kind of interfering with it. But I actually wanted to show this image really also to say that, I mean, this is an example of that kind of heightened moment of traditional documentary photography, what Philip Jones Griffiths calls, you know, of those three stages of a photographer, you're there before the event, they're there either when it's happening, or they're there after, in decreasing sort of levels of desirability. But it's not that simple. Even within this image here, we see a socialist revolutionary Sandinista throwing a Pepsi bottle back at the regime that probably would have supported that corporate's interests. I think a more exciting understanding of the term collect and return, or recycling, while wearing a cross, a crucifix, a symbol of what Marx would have called, you know, the opiate of the masses. Something that Guy Debord obviously extended into the society of the spectacle. So even just something like this, I think, illustrates the fluidity of positions any particular person can actually take at any one time. Now, the critiques, though, of the politics of representation that questioned the assumed objectivity and authority of the photographic medium essentially accused documentary practice of creating a spectacle of suffering that reinforced the systems of oppression and inequality. One of the most articulate critiques of documentary practice came from Martha Rosler in her essay In and Around and Afterthoughts on Documentary Practice from 1985. Now, for Rosler, within a neoliberal ideological climate of self-interest, traditional documentary loses its naive claims to working for social reform, to become a spectacle of suffering produced by careerist photographers. In her own words, documentary testifies finally to the bravery and savvy of the photographer, who entered a situation of physical danger, social restrictiveness, human decay, or combinations of these to save us the trouble. For Rosler, therefore, in calling for charity or sympathy, traditional liberal documentary preserves the oppressive structures of the status quo, while denying the underprivileged or oppressed a voice, and does just enough to pacify the potentially more revolutionary outcome of self-organization. Now, while Meiselas' early career could actually be seen to embody Rosler's critique, her commitment, I believe, to the issues she has explored and photographed is an exception that perhaps proves the rule. Now, importantly, Meiselas also understood the dilemmas of traditional photographic documentary, as he states. The price of collecting information or news is at the cost of living like a human being. On the other hand, the price of becoming involved is that you may not be seen as a reliable witness. Sometimes I think that a photograph is instead of a relationship, and yet a photograph is a relationship. However, and I think importantly, she also understood that this relationship is only critically and effectively activated when the artist, activist, author involves the image back into its historical context of meaning. And for example, Meiselas returned the photographs that she took of that revolution in the 70s back to Nicaragua 25 years later as a catalyst for debate around what actually happened at that time and of its legacy. So the challenges to the ideological framework that did support a traditional documentary practice have, however, primarily resulted in the discussion around photographic communication focusing almost exclusively on the ambiguity of photographic imagery. A spectacle has remained, but has been tamed into a manifestation of the formal visual sophistication of the author. And for me, a more interesting and useful discussion is to explore how these recodable documents can operate in relation to the social contexts within which they are used and understood. Now, the critique of the spectacle, for Rancière, has its origins in Plato's denouncement of the mimesis of theatre, as a place where the spectator is, and I quote, invited to see people suffering as a spectacle of pathos, through the optical machinery that prepares the gaze for illusion and passivity. However, the multiple attempts to challenge the spectacle, as exemplified by thinkers, artists such as Bertolt Brecht, Guy Debord, and indeed Martha Rosler, for Rancière are based on a set of assumed oppositions between, for example, the image and living reality, viewing and knowing, speaking and spectating, which for Rancière forms an intricate dramaturgy of sin and redemption that does not actually challenge the a priori logic of intellectual inequality that these oppositions are actually derived from. Instead, he calls for an intellectual emancipation that is based on what he calls an equality of intelligence. It asserts that an intelligence is not a position to be held, but one that ventures, and again I quote, into the forest of things and signs, to say what it has seen and what they think they have seen, to verify it and to have it verified. An activity that Rancière refers to as the poetic labour of translation. Now, Susan Meiselas' original involvement in Kurdistan began in 1991 when she travelled there on behalf of the Human Rights Watch to document the unearthing of mass graves created by Saddam Hussein's Anfal campaign against the Kurdish people of northern Iraq in the 1980s. And here we see a picture of Dr. Clyde Snow. He's a forensic anthropologist actually unearthing at one of these graves, and he's holding the skull of a young man guessed to be around between the age of 15 and 18. He'd also been blindfolded before he was executed. And this is her original involvement, and it is photography as evidence. It's really quite straightforward. There's no ambiguity to be considered within this image. However, she writes of her first impressions while traveling in this region. In all my work in Latin America, in all my photographing of war, I never saw destruction that was so systematic and so complete. I was trying to be thorough while documenting the destroyed villages. The problem was that there was so little left. Sometimes there was nothing to photograph except piles of rubble, and no way to distinguish what had been there before. Now, I think her anxiety about the lack of any physical indicators of the Anfal campaign that she could actually photograph, I think actually highlighted her own ignorance of the actual Kurdish region, not to mention the historical struggle of the Kurdish people to self-determination. And this is the key point for me, because I think Meiselas' actual acknowledgement of her own ignorance, her refusal to hold that position of intelligence, shall we say, as speaker, moved her to abandon her position as authoritative witness, and instead focused on the important and subversive role that photographs played in the forest of things and signs within Kurdish culture, not only as memorial tokens to lost loved ones, but also as a subversive affirmation of cultural autonomy. For example, there's an image of a man called Jamal Khader Osman. He's shown a picture of himself as a Peshmerga fighter from the 1960s. And she folds images into the website in conjunction with text, for example, that testifies to the experience of using these photographs. And I'll read just two. For example, the Iraqi police monitored shops selling three things: cassettes, photographs, and books. No one was allowed to sell a photograph or take a photograph that showed the tragedy of the Kurdish people. Now, as Meiselas writes to the introduction to the book, what interested me was the intersection and interplay between those who shaped Kurdish life and the lives of the chroniclers who pictured them, the photographers in those photographed, the points of cultural exchange, how the various protagonists crossed one another's paths. Now, the Kurdistan project that developed out of this has gone on to collect a massive and hugely eclectic mix of photographic imagery that ranges from, for example, 19th century quasi-anthropological postcards from the Kahn collection, in this particular case, to studio and snapshot family photographs. Here we have a memorial. These were just submitted from people in the public of a member of the Kurdish community who lives in Germany now, remembering her mother. To police and journalistic images of the many and bloody conflicts for Kurdish independence. And lastly, here's an example. This is from an American paratrooper photographed in northern Iraq in 1991. Just after, actually apologising, his text is apologising for America abandoning the Kurds after the first Gulf War. Now, as you can see from these examples here, I think importantly, these images are used in conjunction with a variety of other documents, such as official government records, news stories, and just purely personal testimony. The splash page of the website, aka Kurdistan, opens with this text. This site, a borderless space, provides the opportunity to build a collective memory with a people who have no national archive. Now, I think this introduction distills the simple and aspirational function of Meiselas' involvement with the region. However, in creating the various manifestations of this project, she has created a powerful tool to aid the political act of imagining the community of Kurdistan. For example, the website is mostly made up of a chronological timeline that can be accessed at any point. You can see it along the bottom there. Now, on the far right-hand side, and actually on the far left-hand side, on either side of that timeline, is the image of a map. And I don't know if people can see that. Which was actually originally presented at the San Francisco conference by the Kurdish League delegation on March the 30th, 1945. Now, I think, importantly, as an introduction to this website, making this map visible, using this aesthetic manifestation of a political cultural aspiration, aptly illustrates the antagonistic nature of this project. For as we can see, the Kurdish territorial claims straddled Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and even ventured into Armenia and Azerbaijan. It's hard to imagine a kind of hotter political potato, actually, today. Now, of course, there's a danger for Meiselas in creating this imaginary Kurdistan. There must be a temptation for the Kurdish political movements to create an unproblematic narrative of Kurdish oppression and subsequent heroic struggle for freedom, using the images Meiselas herself has collected to illustrate this alternative but equally rigid distribution of the sensible. Now, using Rancière's call, I think, for an intellectual emancipation, we can see that Meiselas has avoided this by creating an equivalence or equality of intelligence across all the historical records, whether they are family photographs or government documents. And I think you can see this in the layout of the book. While also forwarding, and I think importantly, the material, fragile human quality of these little tools of history. Now, this reevaluation of intelligence and communication that invites, I think, Rancière's poetic labour of translation has also the useful effect of demolishing the authority of the documentary image as a statement of fact, and allows for a reconsideration of the work as a catalyst for debate, becoming in the process reflexively political. Now, for me, this is aptly illustrated by a section of the website's unknown image archive, where there are images without provenance that are put up for identification. For example, a Danish photographer sent Susan Meiselas this photograph here with the following note. Dear Susan, this old photograph was in our archive. We never use it. Nobody ever asks for it. I don't know where the original comes from, and I don't know how we got it. But I will offer it to you if you can use it for your project. Now, the images of a large group of men on their knees, bent over so their foreheads touch the ground, and their hands are clasped behind their heads while military personnel and vehicles surround them. The image was uploaded with an invitation for anyone with any knowledge of the image's original context to comment. Importantly, there is a strapline to this section of the website that states, the act of memory unlocks the life within each photograph and reclaims its place in history. Now, of course, the purpose of this section of the website is obviously an effort to secure an accurate account of the image's content, to rescue the image from semantic oblivion, suggesting that a photograph is dead without an accurate caption. Importantly, however, the various responses that the images have generated are unedited on the website. And it makes visible the debates around what each image shows, which for me indicates that an image is alive not when its correct caption is secured, but within its contest of meaning. I don't think this contest does not occur within the image itself, but outside the frame by those who encounter and engage with the image. A selection of just 2 responses to this particular picture can illustrate it. Certainly its antagonistic existence, or what Rancière might call its dissensus. The first says, his photos show to the whole world how racist Turkish government was against innocent Kurdish people in the past. Quickly followed by, captured terrorists or future terrorists, you're probably in Europe now helping other terrorists. Quite straightforward dichotomy there. Now, the structure of this website that opens out the debate around what certain images depict, that in this instance has failed to acquire a definitive description, has not failed to take its place in history. Instead, this image illustrates the subjectivity of history, leaving space for alternative readings. As Elizabeth Edwards writes, photographs remain dangerous things. They are never simply archival, but active in the relations between people and people and the weight of their pasts in the present. The photographs that Meiselas used do act as documents, but are pulled into the story of Kurdistan. Importantly, this is not a clear and definitive narrative, but a fractured and contested montage of personal memory, oppression, and political activism. It is a relational archive that acknowledges and encourages the contest of meaning, that shifts the distribution of the sensible, of what is sayable or unsayable, visible or invisible. Through an understanding of the historical relations generated through this material, Meiselas has created an archive of a nation that has not been permitted to exist, yet now seems at least possible. Thank you very much.